The morning of June 4th, 1942. You're standing on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The sun hasn't fully cleared the horizon yet, but the deck is already alive with controlled chaos. Plane handlers are positioning aircraft, Ordinance crews are loading torpedoes, and you're climbing into the cockpit of a Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, serial number Tate. If you're paying attention, if you're honest with yourself, you know something the mechanics fueling your aircraft don't fully grasp. You're probably not coming back. The Devastator was obsolete before the war even started. We're talking about an aircraft that first flew in 1935, ancient by military aviation standards. When you're carrying a torpedo, the thing tops out at about 115 miles per hour. In combat, that's not slow, that's stationary. The Japanese Zero fighters can hit 330 miles per hour and climb like they're defying physics. A Devastator trying to escape a Zero is like watching someone try to outrun a bullet. But here's the brutal mathematics of carrier warfare in 1942. If you want to sink an aircraft carrier, you need torpedoes. Bombs are effective, sure. A carrier can absorb multiple bomb hits and keep operating. But a torpedo, that's different. A torpedo punches through the hull below the waterline. It floods compartments. It can break a ship's spine. And right now, there are 4 Japanese carriers steaming toward Midway Island: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Those 4 ships represent the most concentrated naval striking power in the Pacific. The same carriers that devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months ago. If they're not stopped here, if they reach Midway and eliminate that base, the entire strategic balance in the Pacific tips toward Japan. Hawaii becomes vulnerable. The West Coast comes into range. So someone has to fly the Devastators. Someone has to deliver those torpedoes. And to do that, you have to fly low, 50 to 100 feet above the water, where every wave looks like it could swallow your aircraft. You have to fly straight and level for the final approach because the Mark 13 torpedo, the weapon slung beneath your fuselage, has to enter the water at precisely the right angle. Too steep and it dives too deep. Too shallow and it skips like a stone. And you have to get close, really close. The Mark 13 has an effective range of maybe 1,000 yards, that's slightly more than half a mile. In practice, pilots often get even closer because these torpedoes are so unreliable that you need every advantage you can get. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Let me paint the complete picture of what you're about to do. You're going to fly a slow aircraft at wave-top altitude in a straight line directly toward enemy ships that are surrounded by some of the best fighter pilots in the world and protected by a wall of anti-aircraft fire that can turn the sky into solid metal. The Japanese carriers maintain a combat air patrol of 18 to 24 Zero fighters circling above them at all times. Those Zeros can spot you coming from miles away. They can dive down and tear you apart before you ever get within torpedo range. Every single pilot climbing into a Devastator this morning knows the odds. They heard about the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, where torpedo bombers took devastating losses. They know their aircraft are outmatched. They know the torpedoes they're carrying have a nasty habit of either running too deep or failing to explode on impact. But they also know something else. Those 4 Japanese carriers have to be stopped. At 700 a.m., the first Devastators begin launching from Enterprise and Hornet. By 7:52, torpedo squadrons from all 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, are airborne and heading toward the Japanese fleet. 41 Devastators in total. 41 torpedoes, 123 men. Most of them are about to fly into a slaughter that will accidentally change the course of the Pacific War. Commander John Waldron was not a man who dealt in euphemisms or comfortable lies. The leader of Torpedo Squadron 8, flying off the USS Hornet, had a reputation for being direct, stubborn, and fearless to the point of recklessness. On the night of June 3rd, the evening before the battle, Waldron wrote a final letter to his wife. He knew exactly what was coming. His squadron had trained relentlessly for months. But no amount of training could change the fundamental reality that they were flying obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful carrier force afloat. Waldron was part Sioux Native American, and he carried that heritage with fierce pride. His pilots respected him deeply. Some feared him a little, but they all understood that he had a singular focus: find the enemy, attack, no matter what. On the morning of June 4th, Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from Hornet at 8 M15 Devastators, each carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo. They had one fighter escort, a lone Wildcat that turned back early due to fuel concerns. So Waldron's squadron was on its own. 15 slow-moving torpedo bombers searching for the Japanese fleet across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Here's where Waldron made a decision that would seal his squadron's fate, but also reveal something crucial about his tactical instincts. The planned flight path from Hornet's air group was supposed to follow one direction based on intelligence estimates of where the Japanese fleet would be, but Waldron didn't trust it. He'd studied Japanese tactics obsessively. He'd worked out their probable course himself. And at 9:20 a.m., he broke a radio silence to announce he was deviating from the assigned route. He turned his squadron southwest, following his gut. And he was right. At 9:25 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 spotted the Japanese carrier fleet. 4 carriers steaming in formation with their escorting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers spread around them in a protective screen. The sight must have been both magnificent and terrifying. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, the same ships that had rampaged across the Pacific for 6 months, sinking Allied warships from Hawaii to the Solomon Islands. Waldron didn't hesitate. He immediately began his attack run. No fighter cover, no dive bombers to split the enemy's attention, just 15 torpedo planes heading straight for the carriers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol spotted them instantly. Roughly 40 Zero fighters were in the air, and they came screaming down like hawks on field mice. What happened next was systematic destruction. The Zeros hit Torpedo Squadron 8 from above and behind, the classic attack angle for engaging bombers. Their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns ripped through the Devastator's thin aluminum skin. The TBD had no self-sealing fuel tanks, a feature that might have saved lives but added weight the underpowered plane couldn't afford. When bullets hit the fuel tanks, the plane simply exploded or burst into flames, and the Devastators were so slow that once a Zero locked onto your tail, there was essentially no escape. You couldn't outrun them, you couldn't outclimb them, you could only keep flying toward your target and hope you lived long enough to drop your torpedo. Waldron's plane was hit and went down around 9:40 a.m. He managed to ditch in the water, but he died shortly after, either from his wounds or from drowning. One by one, the rest of Torpedo Squadron 8 followed him into the ocean. Some pilots made it close enough to drop their torpedoes, all of which either missed or failed to detonate due to the notorious problems with American torpedo detonators. The Japanese carriers simply turned, increasing speed to 30 knots, and the torpedoes tracked harmlessly behind them or ran out of fuel. Within 20 minutes of beginning their attack, all 15 planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot down. 29 men died. Only 1 man survived. Ensign George Gay, whose plane was the last to be shot down. He managed to get out of his sinking aircraft, inflated his life raft, and spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, hiding under his raft's seat cushion whenever Japanese ships came near, watching the entire battle unfold around him. He was rescued the next day and would be the sole survivor to tell Torpedo Squadron 8's story. But here's what matters more than the tragedy. Waldron found the enemy. His squadron drew the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to wavetop level and held their attention. Every Zero that was shooting at Waldron's Devastators was a Zero that wasn't at altitude watching for other threats. And while Waldron's squadron was being annihilated, 2 more American torpedo squadrons were converging on the Japanese fleet. They were about to suffer almost identical fates. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, and Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, were both racing toward the same target. Neither squadron knew what had just happened to Torpedo Squadron 8. They had no idea they were flying into a buzzsaw that had just finished chewing up 15 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived around 9:40 a.m., just as the last of Waldron's planes were going down. Lindsay had 14 Devastators, and like Waldron, he had practically no fighter escort, just 4 Wildcats that were supposed to protect 14 slow-moving bombers against 40 Zeros. The mathematics were impossible from the start. Lindsay himself was already wounded before the attack even began. During the squadron's takeoff from Enterprise that morning, his plane had been strafed by a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that had found the American carriers. Shrapnel had torn into Lindsay's leg and shoulder, but he refused to turn back. Now picture what the Japanese pilots were seeing. Another wave of slow, outdated torpedo bombers coming in low over the water, lined up like targets at a shooting gallery. The Zeros, already at low altitude from massacring Torpedo Squadron 8, simply rotated their attention to this new threat. They tore into Torpedo Squadron 6 with the same devastating efficiency. The Devastators started falling almost immediately. Lindsay's pilots were trying to execute a coordinated attack, hitting the carriers from multiple angles to divide the defensive fire and increase the chances that at least some torpedoes would connect. But coordination required time and maneuvering, and time was the one thing these pilots didn't have. The Zeros were simply too fast, too numerous, and too skilled. Japanese pilots in 1942 were among the best-trained naval aviators in the world. Many had combat experience going back to the war in China that started in 1937. They knew exactly how to attack a slow-moving bomber, come in from behind and above, match speed, and methodically shoot the plane apart. 10 of Lindsay's 14 planes were shot down. Lindsay himself, already badly wounded, kept his aircraft steady and dropped his torpedo before his plane was hit again and crashed into the ocean. He went down with his aircraft. Of the 4 planes that survived, only 2 actually made it back to Enterprise. The other 2 ditched in the ocean when they ran out of fuel. Out of 42 men in Torpedo Squadron 6, 20 died. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, arriving around 10 a.m. Commander Massey had 12 Devastators, and unlike the previous 2 squadrons, he actually had decent fighter cover, 6 Wildcat fighters providing escort. For a brief moment, it looked like this attack might have a chance. The Wildcats engaged the Zeros, and a wild dogfight erupted at low altitude, but 6 fighters against 40 was still hopeless odds. Massey led his squadron in, splitting into 2 divisions to attack from different angles, the classic anvil approach that torpedo doctrine called for. The idea was sound. If you attacked from 2 sides simultaneously, the enemy carriers would have to choose which group to turn away from, guaranteeing that the other group would get good torpedo shots. It was textbook tactics, but it required all the attackers to survive long enough to reach their launch points. They didn't. The Zeros broke through the Wildcat screen and began systematically destroying the Devastators. Massey's plane was hit early and exploded. His wingman saw the commander's aircraft simply disintegrate under cannon fire. One by one, the Devastators fell. Some managed to launch their torpedoes before going down, but again, the Mark 13 torpedoes proved nearly worthless. Several ran too deep and passed under the carriers. Others had their detonators fail on impact. The Japanese carriers maneuvered, and the torpedoes that did run true simply missed. 10 of 12 Torpedo Squadron 3 Devastators were destroyed, 30 men dead. Only 2 planes made it back to Yorktown, both shot full of holes. The crew of one plane had to manually crank down their landing gear because the hydraulics were destroyed. They landed with more than 70 bullet holes in their aircraft. Let's add this up. In less than 30 minutes, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been effectively wiped out. Out of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 returned to their carriers. 35 aircraft destroyed, 84 men killed or missing, and not a single hit. Not one Japanese carrier damaged by torpedoes. By any conventional measure, this was a catastrophic failure, a complete disaster, the kind of loss that ends careers and changes battle plans. But something strange happened in those final moments of the torpedo attacks, something that nobody planned, something that wouldn't be fully understood until after the battle was over. The sacrifice of those 84 men was about to create the conditions for one of the most decisive military victories in human history. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsey, bleeding from his wounds and struggling to keep his damaged aircraft under control, made a decision in his final moments that would accidentally create the conditions for one of history's most decisive military victories. When Lindsey arrived at the Japanese fleet with Torpedo Squadron 6, he was facing the same tactical problem every torpedo squadron commander faced. How do you attack carriers that can turn at 30 knots and outmaneuver your torpedoes? The textbook answer was the anvil attack. Split your force and hit the target from two sides simultaneously. If the carrier turns toward one group, it turns broadside to the other. Simple geometry. But executing this maneuver required time, coordination, and most critically, it required your planes to survive long enough to get into position. Lindsey started his approach, intending to divide his squadron for an anvil attack on the carrier Kaga. But the Zero fighters were already swarming, and his pilots were dying. His own plane was barely responding to the controls. The wounds in his shoulder and leg were making every movement agony. In that moment, with Zeros closing in and his squadron being torn apart, Lindsey made a snap decision. He took half the squadron and went straight in at Kaga from the south. The other half of Torpedo Squadron 6, their designated leader already gone, instinctively followed their training and split off to attack from a different angle. It wasn't perfectly coordinated. It wasn't the textbook anvil. But what it did do was force the Japanese Combat Air Patrol to split their attention across multiple attack vectors. Some Zeros chased Lindsey's division, others went after the separated group. And, critically, all of this was happening at wavetop level, with Zero fighters scattered across the ocean surface instead of being concentrated at high altitude where they could spot incoming threats. Now here's where it gets interesting. From a tactical perspective, Japanese carrier doctrine in 1942 called for maintaining a strong combat air patrol at multiple altitudes. You wanted fighters low to intercept torpedo bombers and fighters high to intercept dive bombers. But in the chaos of the moment, with 3 successive American torpedo attacks coming in waves over 30 minutes, the Japanese air controllers had pulled every available Zero down to low altitude to deal with the immediate threat. Think about this from the Japanese perspective. You're an air controller on the Akagi, and you've just watched 41 enemy torpedo bombers come at your fleet in 3 separate waves. Your Zeros have been spectacularly successful. They've shot down 35 of 41 attackers, not a single torpedo hit. Your carriers are undamaged and still launching aircraft for a strike against the American carriers. By every tactical measure, you're winning decisively. The natural human response is to focus on the threat you can see, those slow-moving torpedo planes screaming in at 50 feet above the water, and deal with them. But Lindsey's split approach, as unintentional as it was, had done something crucial. It had drawn the entire Japanese fighter screen down to the deck and scattered them. Zeros were chasing individual Devastators in every direction. Some were returning to their carriers to rearm and refuel after using up their ammunition on Torpedo Squadron 8 and the early parts of Torpedo Squadron 6's attack. Others were still engaged with the surviving torpedo bombers. The result was that at 10:20 a.m., when the last of the torpedo attacks was ending, there wasn't a single Zero fighter above 6,000 feet, and at exactly that moment, 14,000 feet above the Japanese fleet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was arriving with 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. He'd been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, his fuel running critically low, when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. The destroyer was the Arashi, which had stayed behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus that had been harassing the Japanese fleet. McCluskey followed that wake, and it led him straight to the carriers. And when he looked down from 3 miles up, he saw something a dive bomber pilot almost never sees. 4 enemy carriers with absolutely no high-altitude fighter protection. The Zeros were all down at sea level, still dealing with the last torpedo bombers. McCluskey didn't know about Lindsay's split attack. He didn't know about the cumulative effect of 3 successive torpedo squadron attacks, pulling every Japanese fighter down to the deck. From his perspective, he'd just gotten incredibly lucky, but luck had nothing to do with it. 84 men had just died creating this opportunity, and they'd done it completely by accident. McCluskey's arrival at 10:22 a.m. was the convergence of timing, desperation, and unintentional tactics that would change the course of the Pacific War. But to understand why this moment was so devastating, you need to understand what was happening on those Japanese carrier decks 3 miles below him. The Japanese carriers had been caught in the middle of a rearm and refuel cycle. After the initial strikes on Midway Island that morning, the carriers had recovered their returning aircraft and immediately began preparing them for a second strike against Midway. Then around 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane finally reported the location of the American carrier fleet. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, faced an agonizing decision: continue the Midway attack or switch his aircraft to anti-ship loadouts for attacking the American carriers. He chose the carriers. That meant mechanics and ordnance crews on all 4 Japanese flat tops were frantically switching out fragmentation bombs for armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. On the hangar decks and flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, there were aircraft with their fuel tanks topped off, armed torpedoes sitting on carts waiting to be loaded, bombs that had been removed from aircraft piled on the deck because there wasn't time to properly stow them in the magazines below, and fuel lines stretched across the deck to top off the attack planes. It was, in essence, a floating ammunition dump. Then the American torpedo attacks started coming in waves. Each attack forced the carriers to turn hard, maneuvering to avoid torpedoes and present smaller targets. Each attack disrupted the rearming operations, and each attack kept the Zero fighters down at sea level, burning fuel and ammunition. By 10:20 a.m., when the last torpedo bombers were finally being driven off, the Japanese were trying to get back on track. The plan was to launch a massive coordinated strike, over 100 aircraft from all 4 carriers hitting the American fleet simultaneously. On Akagi's flight deck, there were 21 aircraft spotted for launch, fully fueled and armed. Kaga had 30 aircraft ready. Soryu had 21. These planes represented the counterattack that could potentially turn the battle back in Japan's favor. The crews were maybe 10 minutes away from launching. The Zeros that had been fighting at low altitude were being recalled to land, rearm, and join the strike as escorts. That's when McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks. Picture the geometry of what happened next. McCluskey had 2 squadrons of dive bombers, his own Bombing Squadron 6 with 14 aircraft and Scouting Squadron 6 with 17 aircraft, plus Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron with additional Dauntlesses. McCluskey initially designated all his bombers to hit the nearest carrier, which was Kaga. But Best, flying as the leader of a separate group, saw that Kaga was already being attacked and made a split-second decision to shift his aircraft to the next carrier, Akagi. Meanwhile, at almost exactly the same moment, Yorktown's air group arrived. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 17 more dive bombers that immediately began their attack on Soryu. 3 American squadrons, 3 Japanese carriers, all being attacked simultaneously. The Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing. One moment their decks were clear. The next moment, the sky above them was full of dive bombers. The SBD Dauntless dove at a 70-degree angle, starting from around 14,000 feet and pulling out at about 2,000 feet. The pilot had maybe 30 seconds in the dive to line up his target, adjust for wind, and release his 1,000-pound bomb. It sounds like guesswork, but these pilots had trained for months. They knew their aircraft, they understood the ballistics, and most critically, they were diving on targets that were stationary or moving in predictable patterns. The carriers were still recovering from the last torpedo attack and hadn't yet realized the dive bombers were coming. Kaga was hit first. McCluskey's bombers screamed down, and at least 4,000-pound bombs slammed into the carrier. One hit near the forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck, where fueled and armed aircraft were waiting. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Torpedoes detonated, aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, the entire hangar was an inferno. Another bomb hit the aft part of the ship, starting more fires. The crew tried to fight the blazes, but with fuel and ordnance scattered everywhere from the interrupted rearming operations, the fires spread faster than they could be contained. Best's squadron hit Akagi moments later. Best himself personally landed a 1,000-pound bomb directly on the flight deck just behind the midship elevator. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck and exploded among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting there. Just like on Kaga, the result was catastrophic. Akagi's hangar became a blast furnace. Fire spread to the flight deck. Secondary explosions began tearing the ship apart from the inside. Soryu's crew barely had 30 seconds of warning. The carrier's lookouts spotted Yorktown's dive bombers coming down and managed to sound the alarm, but there was no time to do anything except brace for impact. Leslie's squadron dropped with textbook precision. 3,000-pound bombs hit Soryu in rapid succession, one near the forward elevator, one amidships, and one aft. All three penetrated to the hangar deck where 21 fully fueled aircraft sat waiting to launch. The explosions were enormous. Soryu's hangar, like those of her sister carriers, was packed with everything you don't want near an open flame: aviation gasoline, bombs, torpedoes, oxygen bottles for high-altitude flight, ammunition for the aircraft's guns. When those 1,000-pound bombs detonated in the middle of all that, the ship essentially exploded from the inside out. Massive fireballs erupted through the elevator openings, blowing the elevators themselves completely off their mountings. One of Soryu's elevators was thrown into the air and landed twisted on the flight deck. The time was 10:26 a.m. 4 minutes had passed since the first bomb hit Kaga. In those 4 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, half of the entire carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, had been transformed into burning wrecks. This wasn't just damage. This was total destruction. These ships weren't going to be repaired. They were going to sink. Let's understand what made these hits so catastrophic. A carrier is basically a floating airfield built on top of massive fuel tanks. In the hangar deck, you've got aircraft maintenance spaces, fuel lines, ammunition storage, and workshops, all in an enclosed space. When a heavy bomb penetrates to that level and detonates, the blast wave has nowhere to go. It bounces off the bulkheads and the deck, concentrating its force. Everything flammable ignites instantly. Everything explosive detonates, and the carrier's own fuel and ordnance become weapons against itself. On Akagi, the fires reached the forward magazine at 10:46 a.m. The magazine, which contained bombs and shells for the carrier's defensive guns, exploded with such force that it lifted the entire bow of the ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, tried desperately to save his ship. Damage control parties attacked the fires with hoses and chemical extinguishers, but the heat was so intense that men were being roasted alive on the decks. The metal deck plates became hot enough to melt the rubber soles of sailors' boots. At 10:54 a.m., with the fires completely out of control and spreading toward the aft magazines, Aoki gave the order to prepare to abandon ship. Kaga's death was even faster. The ship's damage control systems had been wrecked by the initial bomb hits, and the crew simply had no way to fight fires that large. The gasoline fires were particularly hellish. Aviation fuel burns at extremely high temperatures and spreads rapidly. By 11 a.m., barely 30 minutes after being hit, Kaga's entire flight deck was engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense that the flight deck itself began to buckle and warp. Explosions kept ripping through the ship as more ordnance cooked off. The captain ordered abandon ship at 4:20 p.m., but by then, most of the crew, who could escape, already had. Soryu lasted slightly longer, but not by much. The ship's engineering spaces remained operational initially, and the crew was able to maintain some speed. But the fires were uncontrollable. The ship's fire mains, the pressurized water system used to fight fires, had been destroyed by the bomb hits. Without water pressure, the firefighting efforts were futile. At 10:45 a.m., just 19 minutes after being hit, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. Yanagimoto himself refused to leave, choosing to go down with his vessel. He was last seen standing on the bridge, sword in hand, as the fires consumed the ship around him. The surviving crew members of all three carriers were pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers. They watched their ships burn throughout the afternoon. Kaga finally sank at 7:25 p.m. that evening, taking 801 men with her. Soryu went down at 7:13 p.m., with 718 men lost. Akagi burned through the night and into the next morning. Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, made the agonizing decision to scuttle her. 4 Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi on the morning of June 5th. She sank at 5 a.m., taking 267 men to the bottom. 3 fleet carriers destroyed, 1,789 men killed on those 3 ships alone. Over 280 aircraft lost, not just the planes on the carriers, but also the highly trained pilots and air crews who went down with them. The Japanese had trained these pilots for years. They represented an investment in skill and experience that simply couldn't be replaced quickly. And it had all happened because 41 obsolete torpedo bombers had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level at exactly the right moment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Now let's do the mathematics, because the numbers behind this battle tell a story that's almost harder to believe than the battle itself. 41 torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet. 35 were shot down. 84 men died in those attacks. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. By every conventional metric, the torpedo attacks failed completely. So how did failure turn into the most decisive naval victory in American history? The answer lies in something military analysts call a coordinated attack profile. But the coordination here was completely accidental. Think about it like this. In carrier warfare, the attacker's ideal scenario is to hit the enemy from multiple directions and altitudes simultaneously. You want high-altitude bombers and low-altitude torpedo planes arriving at the same moment, forcing the defenders to split their attention and resources. The problem is that coordinating this kind of attack is incredibly difficult. You're launching planes from ships that are miles apart. The planes fly at different speeds. And you're all converging on a target that's moving at 30 knots and can be anywhere in a huge area of ocean. The US Navy had tried to coordinate exactly this kind of attack at Midway. The plan was for fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers from each carrier to launch together, fly together, and attack together. But it fell apart immediately. The different aircraft types flew at different speeds. The fighters were faster than the dive bombers, which were faster than the torpedo bombers. Radio discipline meant minimal communication. Navigation was done by dead reckoning and hope. The result was that every squadron ended up finding the Japanese fleet independently and attacking piecemeal. Except that piecemeal attack accidentally created the perfect conditions for success. Let's break down the timeline. Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked at 9:25 a.m., pulling Zeros down to sea level. Torpedo Squadron 6 attacked at 9:40 a.m., keeping the Zeros engaged at low altitude and scattering them across different vectors. Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked at 10 a.m., forcing even more Zeros down and splitting the combat air patrol even further. Then, at 10:22 a.m., just as the last torpedo bombers were being driven off, the dive bombers arrived at high altitude with zero fighter opposition. The Japanese simply couldn't defend against threats at 2 different altitudes simultaneously. Here's why. A Zero fighter at sea level, traveling at 200 miles per hour in combat maneuvering, burning fuel and ammunition, chasing torpedo bombers, cannot instantaneously climb to 14,000 feet to intercept dive bombers. The physics don't work. Even if the Japanese air controllers had spotted McCluskey's dive bombers the moment they arrived, and they didn't, the Zeros would have needed at least 5 to 7 minutes to climb from sea level to intercept altitude. The dive bombers only needed 30 seconds to complete their attack runs. This gets even more interesting when you look at Japanese defensive doctrine. The Japanese carrier fleet had radar in 1942, but it was primitive compared to American radar. Japanese radar could detect aircraft at ranges of 80 to 100 miles under ideal conditions, but it couldn't accurately determine altitude or number of aircraft. Most of their early warning came from human lookouts with binoculars. Those lookouts had been focused on the torpedo bombers coming in at wavetop level. When the dive bombers appeared at 14,000 feet, tiny dots against the sky, the lookouts simply didn't see them until it was too late. Let's quantify the cost-benefit ratio. 84 men died in the torpedo attacks. Those deaths purchased approximately 4 minutes of perfect dive bomber attack conditions. In those 4 minutes, American dive bombers destroyed 3 fleet carriers worth approximately $100 million each in 1942 dollars. That's about $1.8 billion in today's money per ship. They eliminated 280 aircraft and over 1,700 trained aircrew, and strategically, they removed half of Japan's carrier striking power in one blow. From a purely tactical mathematics perspective, the exchange ratio was staggeringly one-sided in America's favor. The Japanese shot down 35 American torpedo bombers at the cost of creating the vulnerability that lost them 3 carriers. If you reduce it to pure numbers, the United States traded 35 obsolete aircraft and 84 men for 3 fleet carriers, 280 modern aircraft, and 1,789 Japanese personnel, many of whom were irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircrew. But here's what makes it truly remarkable. Nobody planned this. Waldron didn't know his attack would draw down the combat air patrol for the squadrons behind him. Lindsay didn't know his split approach would scatter the Zeros just before the dive bombers arrived. McCluskey didn't know the torpedo bombers had cleared the way for him. Each squadron commander made decisions based on the tactical situation in front of him, with no knowledge of the bigger picture. They were just trying to execute their missions and survive. The coordination was an accident of timing, desperation, and the independent decisions of men who were mostly dead before the battle was won. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attacks and launched a counterstrike that afternoon, badly damaging Yorktown. But by evening, American dive bombers found Hiryu and destroyed her too. By the end of June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or sunk. Japan would never recover from this loss. But the real story isn't just what happened at Midway. It's what the US Navy learned from those torpedo attacks and how it changed carrier warfare forever. After the battle, American naval intelligence conducted exhaustive debriefings with every surviving pilot and aircrew member. They interviewed George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had watched the entire battle from his life raft. They analyzed Japanese records captured later in the war, and they reached a conclusion that seemed almost counterintuitive. The torpedo attacks hadn't failed. They'd succeeded in a way nobody had anticipated. They hadn't sunk ships, but they'd created the conditions for the dive bombers to do exactly that. This realization led to a complete overhaul of American carrier attack doctrine. The new doctrine, formalized by late 1942 and refined throughout 1943, was called the coordinated attack. The idea was simple but required precise execution. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers would deliberately attack simultaneously from different altitudes. The torpedo planes would come in low, forcing enemy fighters down to sea level. At exactly that moment, dive bombers would attack from high altitude. The enemy would have to choose which threat to defend against, and either way, one group would get through. But the doctrine required new aircraft. The TBD Devastator was immediately retired from frontline service after Midway. Its replacement, the TBF Avenger, was faster, better armored, and carried defensive guns that actually gave it a fighting chance. The Avenger could cruise at 145 miles per hour and reach 275 miles per hour in a dive, still slower than a Zero, but fast enough to have a chance of escaping if attacked. More importantly, the Avenger had self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate protecting the crew. It wouldn't explode from a single burst of machine gun fire like the Devastator did. The U.S. Navy also dramatically improved its torpedoes. The Mark 13 torpedo used at Midway was a disaster. It ran too deep, its detonator failed half the time, and it was slow enough that maneuvering ships could avoid it. By 1943, American engineers had redesigned the detonator, adjusted the depth settings, and increased the speed. The new torpedoes worked. They actually sank ships when they hit them. What a concept. Fighter tactics changed too. The Navy realized that torpedo bombers needed heavy fighter escort. Not just a few wildcats, but dedicated squadrons whose sole job was to suppress enemy fighters during the torpedo run. By 1944, a typical American carrier strike would include 12 torpedo bombers, 24 dive bombers, and 24 fighters. Half the fighters would go in ahead of the torpedo bombers specifically to engage and pull down the enemy combat air patrol. The other half would fly high cover for the dive bombers. The results were spectacular. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, exactly 2 years after Midway, American carrier aircraft used coordinated attacks to devastating effect. Japanese carriers were hit by torpedoes and bombs simultaneously, the torpedoes cracking the hulls open and the bombs igniting fires. The Japanese lost 3 carriers in that battle and couldn't mount effective resistance because their combat air patrols were being pulled in 2 directions at once, just like at Midway. By the end of the war, coordinated attacks had become the standard doctrine for every Navy operating carriers. The British Royal Navy adopted it. Even the Japanese, in their few remaining carrier operations, tried to implement similar tactics. The concept that accidentally emerged from those desperate Devastator attacks at Midway, that you could sacrifice one type of aircraft to create opportunities for another, became fundamental to carrier warfare. But let's not lose sight of what actually happened. 84 men died thinking they had failed. Waldron went into the water, believing his entire squadron had been wiped out for nothing. Lindsay bled to death in his cockpit, probably thinking the same thing. The pilots and aircrew of those 3 torpedo squadrons didn't know they were winning the battle by losing their lives. They just knew they had a job to do, and they did it, even when the job was essentially suicide. That's the real legacy of the Devastator crews at Midway. Not that they accidentally created perfect attack conditions, though they did. Not that their sacrifice led to new doctrine, though it did. The legacy is simpler and harder. They flew anyway. They knew the planes were obsolete. They knew the odds were impossible. They knew most of them wouldn't come back. And they launched anyway, because stopping those 4 carriers was worth any price. There's something else worth understanding about the men who flew those Devastators. They weren't suicidal. They weren't blindly following orders into certain death. Every one of them understood the tactical situation. They knew what they were being asked to do, and they made a conscious choice to do it anyway. Commander Waldron's final letter to his wife, written the night before the battle, didn't talk about glory or heroism. It talked about duty and necessity. He wrote that if the Japanese carriers weren't stopped at Midway, the consequences for the Pacific campaign would be catastrophic. He understood that his squadron might be the only thing standing between those carriers and an open path to Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay, bleeding from shrapnel wounds sustained before the attack even began, could have turned back. No one would have questioned the decision. A wounded pilot returning to his carrier is standard procedure. But Lindsay understood something more important than procedure. His squadron needed a leader. His men needed someone to guide them to the target. So he kept flying, kept leading, kept fighting until his body gave out. That wasn't blind obedience, that was calculated courage. The same kind of courage that kept George Gay flying toward the Japanese carriers even after he'd watched 14 other planes from his squadron get shot down. Gay was the last Devastator from Torpedo Squadron 8 still in the air. He could see the burning wrecks of his squadron mates dotting the ocean. He could see the Zeros circling like sharks, and he kept flying. He dropped his torpedo. He tried to make his aircraft count. Only then, when his mission was complete, did the Zeros finally catch him. The mathematics of sacrifice are never clean. You can't draw a straight line from 84 deaths to 3 carriers sunk and claim it was worth it. That's not how human life works. But you can understand what those men believed was worth dying for. They believed that stopping the Japanese advance was worth the risk. They believed that protecting Midway Island was essential to protecting Hawaii. They believed that buying time for the dive bombers, even if they didn't know they were doing it, was better than turning back. And they were right. The Battle of Midway didn't just sink 4 carriers. It broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. The pilots and aircrew lost on those carriers represented years of training and combat experience. Japan could build new carriers, eventually. But they couldn't replace the men who knew how to fly from them effectively. After Midway, the Japanese Navy was constantly playing catch-up. They were training new pilots to replace the veterans lost in the battle. But new pilots don't have the same instincts, the same judgment, the same ability to make split-second decisions under fire. The Americans, meanwhile, were building an industrial machine that would churn out carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots at a rate the Japanese couldn't match. By 1944, the US Navy had more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had operational aircraft. The strategic balance had shifted completely. And it started at Midway, in those 4 minutes when undefended Japanese carriers sat beneath American dive bombers. Let's talk about the specifics of what made the Devastator attack so effective at drawing down the Japanese combat air patrol, even though it was accidental. The key was persistence and timing. Torpedo Squadron 8 arrived first and immediately began their attack. The Japanese combat air patrol responded exactly as trained. Zeros at high altitude dove down to intercept the torpedo bombers. This wasn't a mistake. This was correct defensive doctrine. Torpedo bombers represented the greatest threat to carriers because torpedoes could sink ships that bombs merely damaged. So the Zeros engaged Torpedo Squadron 8 with overwhelming force, shooting down all 15 aircraft in about 20 minutes. But here's the critical part. 20 minutes of combat at low altitude burns a tremendous amount of fuel and ammunition. The Zeros that destroyed Torpedo Squadron 8 had used up most of their cannon ammunition and were running low on fuel. Several had to return to their carriers to rearm and refuel. That meant when Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived at 9:40 a.m., there were fewer Zeros at high altitude to respond. More had to be pulled down from patrol altitude to deal with this new threat. And again, the Japanese fighters engaged with overwhelming force, shooting down 10 of 14 Devastators. But again, this took time and resources. More Zeros burned through their ammunition. More had to return to carriers to rearm. When Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived at 10 a.m., the Japanese combat air patrol was stretched thin. They were still shooting down American torpedo bombers, still winning every individual engagement, but they were scattered across the sky at low altitude, dealing with attacks coming from multiple directions. The 6 Wildcat fighters escorting Torpedo Squadron 3 added another layer of complexity. The Wildcats couldn't stop the Zeros from destroying the Devastators, but they could delay them. They could force the Zeros to maneuver, to split their attention, to burn more fuel and ammunition dealing with threats that weren't even the primary attackers. By 10:20 a.m., when the last torpedo bombers were being driven off, the Japanese combat air patrol was in shambles. Not because they'd lost many aircraft, they hadn't, but because they were all at the wrong altitude, in the wrong positions, low on fuel and ammunition, and completely unprepared for what was about to hit them from above. The accidental genius of the American attack was that it came in waves. Not a single coordinated strike that could be defeated all at once, but 3 separate attacks, each one pulling the Japanese defensive response a little further out of position. And the timing was perfect, even though nobody planned it that way. If the torpedo squadrons had attacked all at once, the Zeros would have defeated them just as decisively, but then would have had time to climb back to altitude and rearm before the dive bombers arrived. If the dive bombers had arrived too early, they would have faced a fully prepared defensive screen at high altitude. If they'd arrived too late, the Japanese would have had time to launch their counterstrike, and the carriers might have been empty or dispersed. But the dive bombers arrived at exactly the moment when the Japanese defenses were at their most vulnerable, stretched thin, disorganized, out of position, and completely focused on the wrong threat. Wade McCluskey's decision to keep searching for the Japanese fleet, even when his fuel was running critically low, was the final piece of accidental coordination. If he'd turned back when he reached the expected intercept point and found nothing, the dive bombers would never have found the carriers. If he'd turned in the wrong direction, searching in a different area, the result would have been the same. But he spotted the destroyer Arashi and made the logical decision to follow it. And that decision brought him to the Japanese fleet at exactly the right moment. McCluskey later said he didn't consider it luck. He considered it tactical judgment. The destroyer was steaming at high speed on a specific heading. The only reason for a destroyer to be steaming at high speed away from a battle area was to rejoin its main fleet. Therefore, follow the destroyer. It's the kind of logical deduction that seems obvious in hindsight, but requires clarity of thought under tremendous pressure. McCluskey's planes were running out of fuel. His pilots were nervous. The morning mission had already gone wrong in multiple ways. Hornet's air group had missed the Japanese fleet entirely. Enterprise's torpedo bombers had been massacred. And now McCluskey was leading his dive bombers in a box search pattern, burning precious fuel, with no guarantee they'd find anything. The easy decision would have been to turn back, preserve the aircraft, preserve the pilots, try again later with better intelligence. But McCluskey understood that later might be too late. If the Japanese carriers launched their counterstrike and found the American fleet first, the entire battle could swing the other way. So he kept searching. And when he found that destroyer, he followed it, gambling that his tactical judgment was correct. He was right. And that judgment, combined with the sacrifice of 84 torpedo bomber crew members, combined with the precise timing of 3 separate attacks, combined with the arrival of Yorktown's dive bombers at the same moment, created 4 minutes of opportunity that changed the course of World War II. Here's something that often gets overlooked in the telling of this story. The dive bomber pilots themselves didn't know what had happened below them. They didn't know about the torpedo attacks. They didn't know that the Zeros had been pulled down to sea level. When they rolled into their dives and saw no fighters rising to intercept them, they must have thought it was the strangest thing. Dive bombers attacking carriers in 1942 normally faced fierce opposition from fighters. Zeros should have been climbing to meet them, forcing them to dive early or from poor angles, shooting them down before they could release their bombs. But there was nothing. Just clear sky and targets below. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading his section of dive bombers against Akagi, later said it was almost eerily quiet during his dive. No fighters. Minimal anti-aircraft fire because the carriers were still maneuvering from the last torpedo attack, and their gunners were focused on the torpedo bombers limping away at sea level. He lined up his target, adjusted for wind and the carrier's movement, and released his 1,000-pound bomb from about 2,000 feet. Direct hit. Right on the flight deck, just behind the midship elevator. Best pulled out of his dive and looked back to see the bomb detonate. He saw the explosion, saw the fire start, but he couldn't know, in that moment, that his single bomb had just mortally wounded a fleet carrier, that the explosion in Akagi's hangar deck was triggering secondary explosions, that the ship was already doomed. He just knew he'd hit his target and now needed to get away before the Zeros caught him. The Zeros did catch some of the dive bombers on their way out. McCluskey himself was attacked by 2 Zeros that put 52 holes in his aircraft and a bullet through his shoulder. His gunner, Walter Chokalusek, shot down one of the Zeros before they could finish the job, but by then the critical damage was done. The carriers were burning. The Japanese striking power in the Pacific had been cut in half. and the Americans were disengaging, trying to make it back to their carriers before they ran out of fuel. Some didn't make it. 10 planes from McCluskey's squadron had to ditch in the ocean. Their crews were never found. The cost of victory wasn't just the 84 men who died in the torpedo attacks. It was also the dive bomber crews who ran out of fuel on the way home, the fighter pilots who got lost in the chaos and went down at sea, the sailors on Yorktown who died when Hiryu's counterstrike hit them with bombs and torpedoes. Over 300 Americans died at the Battle of Midway, but they stopped the Japanese. They protected Midway Island. They bought time for the industrial might of the United States to mobilize fully, and they proved that the Pacific War wasn't going to be a Japanese walkover. The Americans could fight. They could win. Even when the odds looked impossible. 41 torpedo bombers, 35 shot down, 84 men killed, 0 torpedo hits, and yet, somehow, those attacks were the most successful torpedo runs in the history of naval warfare, not because they sank anything directly, but because they created the conditions for everything else to work. That's the profound irony at the heart of the Battle of Midway. The weapons that failed became the weapons that won. The attacks that looked like disasters became the attacks that saved the Pacific Campaign, and the men who died thinking they'd accomplished nothing became the men who changed history. When George Gay was finally rescued on June 5th, after spending 30 hours in the ocean, one of the first things he asked about was whether the attack had succeeded. Had any of the torpedoes hit? Had the carriers been damaged? The rescue crew told him what had happened. The dive bombers had sunk 3 carriers. A 4th was burning and would sink that evening. The Japanese were retreating. Gay's response was reported as simple and direct. Good. Then it wasn't for nothing. He didn't know, couldn't have known in that moment, that his squadron's attack had been the key to the whole thing. That Torpedo Squadron 8 drawing down the combat air patrol had created the opportunity for the dive bombers to attack, unopposed. He just knew that American pilots had sunk Japanese carriers, and that meant his friends hadn't died in vain. The full understanding of what happened at Midway took months to piece together. It required debriefing survivors, analyzing combat reports, studying the timing of attacks, and eventually, after the war, examining Japanese records to understand what was happening on their carriers during those critical minutes. The picture that emerged was clear. The torpedo attacks had been essential, not in spite of their failure to hit anything, but because of it. Because failed attacks that forced the enemy to respond were more valuable than successful attacks that didn't disrupt enemy defenses. The Japanese destroyed 35 American torpedo bombers, but in doing so, they created the vulnerability that destroyed their own fleet. It's the kind of tactical paradox that military analysts study to this day. How do you account for attacks that fail in their primary objective, but succeed in creating conditions for victory? How do you measure the value of sacrifice that doesn't directly achieve results, but enables someone else to achieve them? The mathematics don't work in traditional military terms. But in human terms, the mathematics are clear. 84 men flew into impossible odds because they believed it was necessary. They did their duty, knowing the cost. And because they did, Wade McCluskey and his dive bomber pilots had 4 minutes of perfect attack conditions. Those 4 minutes sank 3 carriers. Those 3 carriers represented half of Japan's striking power in the Pacific, and the loss of that striking power meant Japan was on the defensive for the rest of the war. From that perspective, the sacrifice of 84 men to eliminate 1,800 Japanese sailors and aviators, to destroy 3 fleet carriers, to cripple Japanese naval aviation, to turn the tide of the Pacific War, the mathematics become clear, not pleasant, not something anyone would choose if there were better options. But clear, this is what war costs. This is what victory requires. Not glory, not heroism in the Hollywood sense. Just men doing impossible jobs because someone has to. The legacy of the Devastator cruise at Midway extends beyond doctrine and tactics. It extends into how we think about sacrifice and success. We're conditioned to think of success in terms of direct results. You attack the enemy, you destroy the enemy, you succeed. But Midway teaches a different lesson. Sometimes success means creating opportunities for others. Sometimes it means absorbing the enemy's attention while someone else strikes the killing blow. Sometimes it means dying without ever knowing whether your sacrifice mattered. The torpedo bomber crews at Midway didn't get to see the carriers burn. Most of them died before the dive bombers even arrived. They went into the water believing they'd failed, believing they'd wasted their lives attacking targets they couldn't hurt with weapons that didn't work. But they were wrong. Their attacks were the most important part of the battle, more important than the dive bombers that sank the carriers, because without the torpedo attacks pulling the Zeros down to sea level, the dive bombers would have been slaughtered just like the torpedo bombers were. More important than the intelligence that predicted the Japanese attack, because intelligence only tells you where to look. It doesn't win battles. More important than the carriers themselves, because carriers are just steel and machinery. It's the men who use them that matter. And the men in those Devastators used their obsolete aircraft and their futile torpedoes to create 4 minutes of opportunity. 4 minutes that changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.